We're talking about Donald Trump's taxes with two Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, David Barstow of the New York Times and David K. Johnston, now with the Daily Beast, also author of the book, The Making of Donald Trump. I want to go to Donald Trump talking about taxes during a Republican primary debate last year at the Ronald Reagan Library in California.
Well, I think the thing about the flat tax, I know it very well, that I don't like is if you make $200 million a year, you pay 10%. You're paying very little relatively to somebody that's making $50,000 a year and has to hire H&R Block to do the work because it's so complicated. One thing I'll say to Ben is that we've had a graduated tax system for many years, so it's not a socialistic thing. What I'd like to do is, and I'll be putting in the plan in about 2 weeks, and I think people are going to like it, it's a major reduction in taxes. It's a major reduction for the middle class. The hedge fund guys won't like me as much as they like me right now. I know them all, but they'll pay more. I know people that are making a tremendous amount of money and paying virtually no tax, and I think it's unfair.
That's Donald Trump talking about taxes during the Republican primary debate at the Ronald Reagan Library. Your response to that, Donald K. Johnston, he says that's unfair.
Well, it is yet another example of Donald says one thing and does another, because the last year that we know Donald Trump actually paid income taxes was 1977. And we know from other public records that in recent years he reported an income of less than $500,000 for tax purposes. So for Donald Trump to complain that people are living tax-free is just absurd.
What most surprised you by the Times revelations of these tax documents, of Donald Trump's tax returns?
The interest that he had. He collected about $7 million of interest. Now, if he bought regular corporate bonds, that implies he owes $100 to $150 million worth. But he may have owned junk bonds that were bought at a very low price, and that interest, therefore, may have represented a much smaller investment. Would be still tens of millions of dollars, but a much smaller investment. But I was surprised at how much interest he was collecting, because that's a very, very conservative thing to do. And Donald presents himself to the world as this swashbuckling, brilliant business genius. The second thing is the size of the loss. I covered this back then for the Philadelphia Inquirer and wrote a book about Atlantic City. And I'm having a hard time figuring out how Donald got to, even over a period of years, $916 million of net operating losses. And David, by the way, earlier made a point. He couldn't use that much. He doesn't have that much income. His income does not reflect a man who is a billionaire at all. It reflects a wealthy person, but not even close to the billionaire class.
What about that, David Barstow?
One thing I just wanted to focus in a minute, which is his basic presentation right now is, you should elect me because I know all the tricks of the tax code. I know, and he said, the tax code's unfair, and he personally has benefited from that unfairness. And so, therefore, I'm the guy to fix it. But what is, I think, also noteworthy is that we have yet heard from him any specific proposal to actually fix any of these provisions that benefited him so richly in this 1995 tax return. He has talked about some changes to the tax code, but those changes that, as best as anyone can assess them so far, they're fixes that would actually further benefit him.
His plan, Amy, is very oriented toward people at the top. Think of it as George W. Bush's tax cuts on steroids. And by the way, this is an area I know very well. I'm literally drafting my next book is a new federal tax code for the 21st century. But, you know, Donald and I actually had lunch about these issues in 1990. And I pointed out to him that he had a $3.4 million negative income, and he only needed $1 to pay no taxes. He actually could have made a little bit of money and paid no taxes, and suggested that if he reorganized his partnerships, he could, in essence, sell those tax benefits to somebody else. And Donald, who was nonplussed, he couldn't imagine a journalist understood the tax code. I don't think he really understood the points I was making to him at the time, because he doesn't focus well on things. He didn't do the stuff that's here. His tax advisors, notably Jack Mitnick, did this.
So the Trump Organization has threatened to sue you, David Barstow, in the Times?
They have. They've taken, actually, I think, a really remarkable position with us. The letter that they sent to us before we published took the position that unless we had the specific blessing and permission of Donald Trump to write a story about his tax returns, we would be in violation of the law. It was almost, I mean, the notion of prior restraint on the press has been roundly dismissed in Supreme Court decision after Supreme Court decision. The Supreme Court has ruled over and over and over again that if reporters obtain documents in the way we obtain them, we have a perfect right under the First Amendment to publish information that's in the public interest.
And this goes directly, by the way, to why Donald Trump isn't getting the critical coverage he should be getting. He called me at home on April 27th to threaten to sue me. Some of the freelance articles that I have written were lawyered way beyond all reason out of fear. And I've had 2 news organizations say we can't report that because we're afraid that Donald Trump will sue us. This is an extraordinary thing for a politician to do. And the Supreme Court in this country has been very clear back to the 19th century that the highest and most protected form of speech is political speech. And this is all about, falls under the rubric of political speech.
But not only is it political speech, right, but there is a tradition in this country, as you mentioned, going back to the 1970s, of presidential candidates releasing their tax returns for the very reason that we're talking about. It helps us have an informed debate about their finances and how they pay taxes.
And because we don't want another crook in the White House. Remember, Richard Nixon's tax guy went to prison, and he wasn't indicted simply as a courtesy to the office of the presidency, and his vice president confessed to a resigned, confessed to a tax crime. We don't want to have tax felons in the Oval Office.
During a forum in September, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and filmmaker Laura Poitras asked New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet if he would publish information from Donald Trump's tax returns, even if it meant risking jail time. They were also joined by the Washington Post associate editor Bob Woodward. This is a part of the exchange.
I would argue that for a presidential candidate whose whole campaign is built on his success as a businessman and his wealth, who's given different versions of his wealth, I agree with you.
So you're going to publish them if you get
Yeah, but the problem is 5 years.
I would publish them, but I have to bring them to the Post. Yeah.
The problem is 5 years.
And if it means having to be drawn into a grand jury, you have to go.
Yes.
Like, you have to fight it. You can't let it.
It's 5 years in jail. And Mary Jordan's husband, Kevin, suggested that if we publish them and get them and get 5 years in jail, that everyone at the Post take a day.
Yeah.
It's kind of like jury duty. I don't know that they would allow that, but if the New York Times gets them and they send you to jail, I will come over and take a day, maybe even 2 days.
Thank you.
So,
but you know, this is central.
So you are going to publish them?
Pardon?
You're going to publish them with your
I think.
Are you surprised to hear that?
Would have
he hasn't answered.
No.
You're right. I mean, the question is, some things you have to do.
So there you have Bob Woodward and New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet. David Barstow, your boss. You
know, there were a lot of difficult things about bringing this story to the public on Sunday. From my perspective, the least difficult part of it was deciding that the legal threats from Mr. Trump were not worth losing a minute's sleep over. I think the position that they've taken, and we have some of the best First Amendment lawyers in the business working for us, they think that he's taken a position that is so outside the norm of the American legal tradition that we don't feel like these kinds of threats are anything to sweat over.
David, if he gets elected, he will have the power of federal law enforcement. I'm not worried if he threatens to sue me, as he has if he loses. But if he wins, he could put you and I and Dean Baquet on no-fly lists, and the courts have been very reluctant to let people off those if the government claims national security. He can do all sorts of things to mess up your life, and he's made it clear he will do this. He talks as if the president is a dictator with unlimited power who doesn't need to pay attention to Congress or to the courts. He's talked to firing generals, and the first thing someone does who plans to turn a republic into a dictatorship is they fire those general officers who are loyal to country country and replace them with people loyal to him. And in my book, I quote Donald at length in several forums as saying what matters to him is getting revenge. That's his philosophy. Get revenge, even though he says he's a Christian. Get revenge, and absolute loyalty to him, the person. That's what these threats of litigation should really concern the voters about.
I think that anyone who cares about an independent free press should be paying closer attention to these kinds of threats, simply because they're not normal. This letter that was sent to us by one of the top litigators in New York, who's now representing Mr. Trump. It's so outside the norm I mean, sure, we get threatening letters all the time, and we get lawyer letters all the time. And they
go with the job.
It goes with the job, goes with the territory. But this was extraordinary. My jaw almost dropped when I read it. Not because I was because what he's taking a position that unless he, Donald Trump, personally blesses the New York Times writing a story about his income tax returns, we're committing a crime.
And
we're violating the law.
He said things like this for a long time. He told the New York Times that, first of all, his father wasn't arrested at a KKK rally with a pitched battle with police in 1927, and he didn't live at that address. Well, he lived at that address, and he was arrested. And then he said, well, there were no charges. They just arrested him. Therefore, you shouldn't write about it. He has said at campaign rallies, we're going to change these laws and sue these journalists and get rich. He said at other campaign rallies, they shouldn't be allowed to write things if you don't think that that's what they should be. This is not the democratic process. This is the language of someone who believes that he is a dictatorial king or would be. What did the Trump campaign say to you when you reached out to them before you published this?
I mean, what's interesting is the first response, like official response, was this letter from this high-priced lawyer threatening to, rain legal hell on us if we went forward. The second response, then 30 minutes later, the second response was a statement they released saying basically he's a brilliant businessman who has a fiduciary obligation to his family and his businesses not to pay any taxes. And then it went on to say, and here are all the taxes that he does pay. This long laundry list of taxes. But of course, what was missing from that long laundry list was federal income tax. It was the second response that we thought was the far more telling and important response.
And to be fair to Donald, he did pay New Jersey state income tax because of its rules. On, I think it was $1.4 million of New Jersey state income, he paid around $96,000 of tax. We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Our guests are David K. Johnston, author of The Making of Donald Trump, and we're talking to David Barstow, who led the New York Times team analyzing part of the Trump tax returns that they had mailed to them from, did you say Trump Tower? That was the return address?
The return address indicated it was from Trump Tower.
Who do you think it was?
I mean, I think we've been, like everybody else, trying to figure it out and reading the tea leaves and examining these documents and doing everything we possibly can to encourage additional leaks to come to us.
There's a good chance it was Donald himself. Donald has a history of leaking things that you and I might think are damaging, but that he thinks enhance his reputation. We'll be back with the Davids. Is it they who are taking on Goliath, or are they the Goliath, as the press in this country? We will see. David Barstow and David K. Johnston will